Welcome to the start of the 5th season of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. In this season, we will dive into the Gaza war and its aftermath. We're now into the 10th month since the October 7th massacres. The U.S. Israel relationship has faced an unprecedented series of challenges. Virtually no other event in the 76 years since Israel's establishment has attested the U.S. Israel relationship in such a consequential way as the Israel-Hamas war. While President Biden became the first U.S. president to visit Israel during wartime after October 7th, the ongoing war and the hostage crisis have underscored both profound strengths and strains in the bilateral relationship. This will require tough decisions to revitalize key elements in the relationship as the two countries move forward. We are on the eve of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's July 24th address to a joint session of Congress, which comes at a pivotal moment for U.S.-Israel relations. This will be Netanyahu's fourth address to a joint session, breaking the record among world leaders, actually surpassing his hero, Britain wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Netanyahu was invited by the entire congressional leadership in a show of bipartisan support, despite mounting political divisions over the war in Gaza. President Biden is unique in that he calls himself a Zionist, who refers to the U.S.-Israel security relationship, as many presidents have, as ironclad. Biden has also a 4-decade personal relationship with Netanyahu. However, the Gaza war has put outsized strain on the bilateral relationship. Is this strain a temporary consequence of the war, or does it represent a new and enduring divide between the two countries? Today, I am thrilled to be joined by my colleague and friend Dennis Ross to discuss the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship and possible trajectories for the alliance in this inaugural episode of the 5th season of Decision Points. Dennis is the counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and a former special assistant to President Obama. A respected diplomat, negotiator, and policymaker, Dennis has played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in Middle East peace negotiations over successive presidencies. He was the U.S. point man for the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations and wrote an authoritative book on the U.S.-Israel relationship called Doomed to Succeed. I should say the two of us have co-written 2 books together related to issues in no small measure connected to the U.S.-Israel relationship as well. So it is just so wonderful to have you, Dennis, and inaugurating the new season of Decision Points, this being our 5th season, and very auspicious that this first episode is pegged with the visit of the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, to come to speak to a joint session of Congress, and of course to a meeting with President Biden. So why don't we just dive in? I think we could start with this very point of leadership. So just some sort of context of the whole relationship between how we look at long-standing personal relationships between leaders, and does this help them successfully or unsuccessfully in navigating policy differences? Are there certain points of history that we could use as analogies to look at this U.S.-Israel partnership? Is there a sense that personal relationships between leaders have smoothed out, or has it exacerbated policy differences? This is just a conversation between us. So Dennis, over to you. What do you think?
Well, David, first, thanks for having me. I'm honored to kick off the season with you. I do think the relationship between leaders does smooth out what can be real problematic issues. There's always going to be tensions even among the closest families. There's going to be disagreements. And the reality is, between the United States and Israel, our interests don't always completely align. And when they don't completely align, that's the moment when you actually need leaders to have a lot of trust in each other. When leaders don't have much trust in each other, it makes each issue that emerges that is a potential problem, it turns it from a potential problem into something that might be something more enduring as a division. And it doesn't mean it may not carry on. It could carry on. Of course, you have a change in administration, and this relationship obviously has a political coloration as well, so that can influence a successor. I'm thinking of the difference between Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. The perception was that there was a problem between the United States and Israel during the Bush administration, notwithstanding the reality that the Bush administration did a lot for Israel. The truth is, in taking care of Iraq, it was removing one of the major threats to Israel. But the relationship between George H.W. Bush and Yitzhak Shamir was a terrible one. And it was a function of a basic misunderstanding from their very first meeting, where Bush emphasized that settlements were a problem for him, and Shamir responded by saying they shouldn't be a problem. And Bush interpreted that as meaning, okay, they won't build. I recall being told after the meeting, because it was a one-on-one meeting, that Bush was confident now the settlement issue was taken care of. And I said, why does he think that? I was told that, well, he said, and it's by Baker, Secretary Baker said to me, Bush feels that it's not a problem because he told him, this is a real problem for me, and Shamir came back and said they shouldn't be a problem. To which I said, he's offering a judgment they shouldn't be a problem, not that they won't be a problem. In fact, I went immediately to Eli Rubinstein and I said, you need to send a letter and explain there's a misunderstanding here, that you don't want this to be a problem, you'll try to manage it, but you do have an approach to settlements, and it's clearly different from what the Bush attitude is, and if he thinks that now there's going to be building, he's going to see this as a betrayal. It took them 6 months to write the letter, and in the meantime, they took steps, and the reality is Bush never trusted Shamir. For Bush, when you have a meeting that's one-on-one, for him, this is sort of man-to-man, person-to-person. You look someone in the eyes, you say something, and you work understanding that. And if that's a meeting that in his mind is betrayed, then it affected him throughout the course of his administration. And he never trusted Shamir. Bill Clinton came in and from the beginning built this bond with Rabin. He not only respected him, he came to revere him. Was the character of the relations different between the two? Yes. I look at Reagan and Menachem Begin during the Lebanon War. At one point, Reagan goes, gosh, he's a hard guy to like. It meant that those who, like Caspar Weinberger, who had a real problem with Israel, this is a guy who wanted to break relations with Israel over Lebanon, literally break relations. And Reagan, 5 times during the course of the summer of 1982 in the siege of Beirut, 5 times he threatened the future of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. That personal relationship was important. Eventually, Reagan's instincts reestablished themselves, but it helped that he had a Secretary of State in Schultz who had a very strong personal attachment to Israel that most people, when he came in, didn't understand. And he did a lot to sort of bring things and put them back on track. The personal relationships do matter, and I would say the personal relationship between Joe Biden and Bibi Netanyahu is not what it was when this administration came in. I think Biden came in with a history of knowing Bibi. He's felt over the course of this war that was basically provoked by the onslaught by Hamas. From time to time, he's felt misled by Bibi, fairly or not. And here again, we deal with the issue of perceptions. Is to see these meetings between Obama and Bibi. They would be held at a really high intellectual level. And both would come out of the meetings feeling pretty good about the meeting, and it would last for a day or two when one or the other would say something in public. And then they'd say, oh, you see? At the time, I was frequently in the middle. Like I was, well, look what your friend's doing. And again, not surprisingly, leaders personalize everything. That's how they see the world. Everything is seen through that lens. It doesn't mean there isn't a more fundamental basis to the relationship, but the coloration of that relationship, the instinct to make certain kinds of decisions, is heavily influenced by the relationship between the two individuals.
You mentioned the relationship between Obama and Netanyahu. I mean, to me, part of the problem, and you said, look, it's obvious that, a superpower and a smaller power, their interests might converge a lot, but they're not always aligned perfectly. But I wonder what the impact is on these relationships. I think in the Obama-Bibi era, there was a sense that each one was almost trying to thwart the other's kind of grander strategic vision. That for Netanyahu, it was about Iran. The JCPOA, the dialogue with Iran, was very much Netanyahu saw, this is not a small point. This is the core. And you had Obama, who really came into power, that he was going to create political distance between the Muslim world and its extremists and bring a lot of the Muslim world to America's side in the aftermath of 9/11, and saw Netanyahu on the Palestinian issue as not being sensitive to America's kind of overriding strategic interest there, as the president articulated it, and saw this as a core interest of the United States under his administration. That, to me, is part of this, that the trust is such a predicate when these interests invariably are not perfectly aligned, but it seems like it gets much stickier when you think the other side is actively sees the world very much not just at variance, but almost at complete odds from where you're going.
See, here's the irony, and I think you kind of capture an important point here. Where the issue of trust comes in is when, in fact, you have different worldviews. And it allows each side to become more appreciative of how the other is seeing things, and to then make more of an effort to try to find ways to be responsive. I mean, it's going to be within bounds, because if you have a different worldview, it's not so simple to reconcile it. But the tendency to give someone the benefit of the doubt is very different if you have trust. Now, when you have different worldviews, and they did have different worldviews, although Obama in the first term was not the same as Obama in the second term. Obama in the first term made a real effort to show Bibi on Iran, you won't have to act militarily because we're going to put the kind of pressure on them that will change their behavior. And by the way, Bibi actually never wanted to act militarily. He always believed that with the right kind of economic pressure, Iran would change. So there was a convergence conceptually in the first term. Now, what happens in the second term is two things. One is the character, the approach of how we negotiate is different. In the first term, the fundamental point of departure for the negotiations with Iran, we only had multilateral ones, even though we created a back channel towards the end of the first term with the Iranians. I want to get to that in a second. There was a basic sense that if a negotiation needs to change the structure of the Iranian nuclear program, so the capability is so limited that it reflects an intention. If you shrink the size of the Iranian nuclear program to the point where they can't have a nuclear weapon, then in effect, the capability dictates that there's a different intention. That was the approach. When it became at the beginning of the second term, a judgment was made based on the negotiations. It wasn't the beginning, it was in the first year, 2013. The back channel produced a judgment that the Iranians couldn't reduce to the extent that we wanted them to reduce. And if we continued to hold that out as the objective, we wouldn't achieve anything. It's kind of your notion. You always talk about if you can't hit a home run, at least hit a single. And that's exactly what took over the Obama administration in the second term on the Iran nuclear approach in the negotiations. They compounded that, at least in the Israeli eyes, by having a back channel and not telling the Israelis they had the back channel. I will tell you, this was raised while I was still in the administration, because I was the one who was sent to Oman to meet Sultan Qaboos to make the case for why we needed a back channel and what the aim of it was. And we used the Omanis because they had delivered on the release of these 3 American hostages who had been in prison because they hiked across the border from Iraq into Iran, a natural place to be hiking, of course. The key here is that when we raised the discussion of having a back channel, I was all for it. Look, I'm the one who was helping to make the case for it. But I said, you have to go tell the Israelis. This is existential to them. We cannot be doing it behind the back of the Israelis because they're going to find out. And when they find out, there's going to be a profound sense of betrayal on their part. And I lost the argument because there are others, I won't get into who were basically saying, oh, the Israelis, even if you tell Bibi one-on-one, which was what I was saying, in my experience with Bibi, he never leaked anything if it was one-on-one. If it was done in front of others, you can assume it's going to come out. If it's done one-on-one, he will not leak it. There were others who were saying you can't trust him, he'll use this to undermine it, he'll reveal it to people in the Congress, we won't be able to get it to go forward, and Obama sided with them. And of course, the Israelis found out. I have a great story to tell, not so much about the Israelis finding out, but an indication of why they would have. So when I was sent to have this secret meeting in Oman, I get back from Oman. I get a call from the British ambassador asking if he could come see me. I said, sure, because I would see the British ambassador. Comes in, and we're going through the region, and he's speaking, asking all sorts of questions. Then suddenly he stops and he says, oh, by the way, how was your trip to Oman? This was the proof positive that the Israelis were going to know. And of course they did know, and they felt betrayed. And it added to the sense of distrust. And this gets back to what you were saying. On a core issue, if there's distrust, it colors everything else.
And so, look, let's talk about the idea of war, because the Gaza war has gone on now for over 9 months. This is a dimension here, clearly, in terms of leadership and how they relate to each other during wartime. And, you think of even the quintessential case, no one's comparing people to these people, but FDR and Churchill. Coalition maintenance is never easy, especially not easy when you're the junior member, as I think Churchill found out. I'm just trying to understand, Israel's been used to fighting shorter wars, the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the 1973 war, as you call it, 19 days, short wars. Even the Lebanon War was primarily in the summer of 82, even though it lingered. The Intifada, you could say, went on for a while, but it was certainly at its peak in 2002 and July 2001. Long wars are going to put a strain, it just seems invariably, on any sorts of leadership. I'm trying to understand what helps and what hurts in these relationships during wartime. You made an important point about the Gulf War. Ultimately, what happened in 1991 between Bush and Shamir, who had this enmity towards each other and, didn't speak to each other for months, and you know this so well, in the run-up to the Gulf War. But there was a glue here. The glue was there was a common adversary, and that the United States could credibly go to Shamir and say, listen, we're pounding your worst enemy. Your interest is not to fracture the coalition by retaliating for Scud attacks. We know the ethos of Israelis when it comes to self-reliance. We're aware. We know your concerns about deterrence and how Israel has to live in the Middle East if it doesn't retaliate. But we also know that you have a supreme interest in Saddam Hussein being defeated. And I have to believe, and this was a historical analogy in wartime, while having the common glue, that was going to smooth over, mitigate some of these differences. And I don't know if there was other historical analogies you could think of about how the U.S. and Israel navigated differences during wartime.
Look, even in this case, it wasn't Bush and Shamir, it was Baker and Shamir. Baker did all the calls to Shamir. Bush did not. That's kind of testimony to the nature of the relationship. But the stakes were high enough that we had to find a way to manage Shamir. And in the end, Shamir never approved a retaliation, notwithstanding the enormous pressure he was under. That did create some appreciation for him, by the way, in the White House, including with Bush, although he never warmed to him because he felt that he had misled him. And
because Shamir really thought that he was putting money in the proverbial bank here, that if I yield to George Bush on something he really cares about, I can repair my relationship, turn it around, and all this enmity will be of the past.
I think it's true. It is interesting. I have to say, sometimes you can have a relationship that builds, even if it's not between the president and the prime minister. Baker actually built a relationship with Shamir. There was a point when we were on the way to Madrid. The last issue we had to deal with was representation of the Palestinians at Madrid. And I'll never forget this meeting. We were in it, and Baker says to Shamir, no one who will be on the list will be someone who is a member of the PLO. I give you my word on that. And Yossi Beron immediately chimes in and says, that's not good enough. And Shamir cuts him off. He says, yes, it is. If the secretary gives us his word, that's good enough. It was quite poignant, and it showed the relationship that had built between the two of them. I remember Baker saying to me at a later point, he said, he's a tough guy to deal with, but I kind of like the guy.
I heard directly from Baker, I'm sure you heard this a number of times, and everyone was saying that Baker got word, I think, on his mother's death while sitting with Yitzhak Shamir, and people assumed they had
I was there with him.
A very frosty relation. But he said to me, David, look, if you sit with Shamir alone, he said, nothing leaks. You could trust him 100%.
It's true.
And I saw with Baker, like, his face brightened up when he said that.
Well, look, it didn't mean that he was prepared to refrain from helping Yitzhak Rabin defeat him. No, he was, because there was still a sense that we would be better off if Rabin was the prime minister. But he really felt that with Shamir, there were certain things you could count on. I mean, it is interesting that on the settlement issue, he would refrain from giving promises.
This brings us now to the current situation with Gaza. And I just think for our listeners, it's just worth talking about. We talk about the Biden-Netanyahu relationship, the strengths, the tensions, and then we'll get to the politics of this in both countries in a minute. But I do think, there's that famous line of Biden, which has been cited now in the media a lot, where he says, I've known Bibi for 40 years, I love you, but I don't agree with anything you say. So on one hand, you have the sense of there's a strength that they both want to topple Hamas. They want to, demilitarize Hamas's capacity to degrade it in a way that it can never be a threat to Israel. They both would love a breakthrough, certainly with Saudi Arabia, although that's probably an episode in and of itself and how it's tied in to where things are now. And they both want to isolate Iran in some way, maybe in different ways. So there's convergences there. Just this week, Biden said about Hamas, look, they're a bunch of thugs, and there's certainly no romantics when it comes to view of Hamas. And there's also, by the way, I think that Biden and Netanyahu's penchant is to try to solve problems behind closed doors, but it seems that Biden's frustration is that his kind of signature style of working things out on the phone or quietly is often not bearing fruit, and that has led to the frustration, and it's spilled over into public statements by the president. And, there have been videos of the Prime Minister saying things on weapons that maybe could have been solved quietly also. The tension seems obvious, the differences over the humanitarianism role, and I think there's a sense that Biden thinks, well, Netanyahu, doesn't he get it? Of course, the more you do on humanitarian, the more you build space politically for yourself to prosecute this war. Doesn't he realize this is an Israeli interest? And again, maybe after the attack on the World Kitchen workers, that Israel has come around on the humanitarian. But if it would have happened months earlier, it could have eased things for the White House. I'm just trying to look at the strengths and the tensions and how has it evolved over the course of this war that you feel on the humanitarian issue. On Rafah, for example, Israel took America's suggestion, get the public out of the way, get people so they're not hurt in Rafah. Israel worked the edges, going to the Philadelphia Road, which is truly strategic. That's the corridor between Egypt and Gaza where there's cross-border smuggling underground. So on one hand, the U.S. and Israel have shown to me a certain resilience in working through differences. And that to me is a sign of maturity when you can work through differences. Again, I think it shouldn't have had to take so long. On the other hand, Israel would say, hey, we were proven right. Rafah was not the bloodbath that all the critics were saying it was going to be. So on one hand, though, they have been able to work through their differences. And on the other hand, the leaders are not exactly warm and fuzzy leading into this visit. I was just wondering how you assess the evolution over time between Netanyahu and Biden over the course of the war. Where is the strains deeper than they should have been, and where has the relationship proven to be more resilient?
The essence of the relationship has remained intact, and that's because Joe Biden refers to himself, the only American president who's ever referred to himself, as a Zionist. Zionism as a term has become so charged, and yet he doesn't shy away from saying, you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. And he says even now, he says, if Israel didn't exist, every Jew would feel threatened. So he believes that Israel not only has a right to exist, it needs to exist. That's a fundamental. And it's pretty hard to get more fundamental than that. This is also the only American president who ever went to Israel during a war. Having worked in several White Houses, I can tell you without qualification, I know exactly what he was told when he said he wanted to go. Everybody, they would have lined up everybody in the White House staff. They would have brought in the Secret Service to tell him he can't go. And he said, I'm going. Presidents make decisions. This was an extraordinary decision by him. And the signal it sent to Israel at a time when it was reeling, and Bibi, by the way, was reeling. It was pretty clear for the first week, Bibi was in a state of shock. Here's Joe Biden who shows up. It sent an unmistakable signal of commitment, number one, but it also reflected a fundamental attitude about the nature of the U.S. Israeli relationship. And Bibi, of course, got that. Bibi was being buffeted by a different set of political pressures. Within the country as a whole, almost nobody wanted to be providing humanitarian assistance because they're holding our hostages, they're inhuman, They don't allow any access. We don't know what the status is. The Red Cross can't go in. Why should we be providing humanitarian assistance at a time when they do that? Plus, there were images of when the hostages were being taken back with crowds of people leering at them. So the view within Israel was, why should we be doing this? And this was actually a left-to-right issue. It wasn't just the extreme right of the coalition. There was a political price to be paid by him to be providing humanitarian assistance. For Biden, he understood humanitarian assistance was the key to creating time and space to allow Israel the ability to go do what they needed to do militarily. And Bibi didn't do what was necessary in that regard. And number two, Biden over time came to resent what he saw as, I'm paying a political price for my support for Israel, but you, the Prime Minister of Israel, aren't prepared to pay any political price. That added to his sense of there's an asymmetry here and it's just wrong. And then the attack on the World Food Kitchen was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. Because for Biden, I've been telling you, you have to allow humanitarian assistance, and you're not doing it the way you should be doing it. And then the people who are completely selfless get killed. Okay, it was an accident, but it shows that you don't put a high priority on protecting the lives of those who are getting humanitarian assistance in. So this is what produced for Biden, I think, an increasing level of frustration that eventually spilled over. I know for sure that there was no plan within the administration to announce the withholding of the 2,000-pound bombs. And Biden, in a press interview, just said it. There was no expectation he was going to say it because here was Biden reflecting what he emotionally felt, and he let it come out. There has been a tension there, and Bibi frequently has obviously said things that reflected what he felt he needed for the sake of his own coalition. And I think within the White House, there's a sense that Bibi frequently was choosing Ben-Gvir over Biden. So it grated on this. But all this still takes place within a certain context, and you put your finger on it to begin with. Is there a real disagreement on what the strategic objectives are? No. There's never been a disagreement on that. Hamas cannot be in control of Gaza. Gaza cannot be a platform for attacks again against Israel. Now, when you agree on the fundamental strategic outcome, it allows you to manage your differences. And so, in a sense, we have managed our differences. Rafah was a reflection of the Israelis responding, as you said, to the American concerns. More of that could have been done across the board from the beginning. If there had been more of the equivalent of those kinds of discussions early on, you probably would have avoided some of the problems that we ended up facing between the two.
Rafah was a sense of where they really did work through their differences. It didn't mean they ended exactly in the right place for each of them. I'm sure the administration would have wanted more of a time for a movement of people to get to places that the conditions are more perfect. But for the most part, they did work through the differences, and that led the administration actually to pull back and make no public criticism of the areas where they felt Israel fell short, because they thought on the big picture, they're listening to us and they're acting accordingly. And I think that does matter. Are you willing to not just see things similarly, but are you willing to act on that basis? I think Rafah was a case where they actually did work through a lot of those differences. But, you alluded to the role of politics, and you've heard me a million times, what's the nexus point between the policy and the politics? But from Biden's perspective, there can't be this asymmetry that I'm taking all the political risks domestically and you don't take risks. And I'm sure I'm not in the room when Netanyahu is rejoinder or on the telephone when he might say is, yeah, but you're elected for 4 years, Joe, and on any given Wednesday, they could pull the plug on me and my government falls.
Yeah.
So our systems are not symmetrical either. And therefore, my attentiveness is going to have to be at a different frequency than yours. The politics in both of these countries, America, we're in an election year. Israel now, every Israeli feels that they're, I don't want to say the word expert, but they're familiar with the word progressivim, the progressive wing. And how is Biden trying to manage the progressive wing to keep his people together and yet maintain, as you say, this very core commitment? And he really does understand the Israeli DNA, I think, in that he understands that stateless Jews are defenseless Jews. And then that's why October 7th was so earth-shattering, because here was a state of the Jews and the people were still defenseless. So he understood the enormity of this tragedy. America, we're in an election year, and the Israelis, they always seem like they're on the verge of an election year. How do you thread the needle between the policy and the politics, and especially that you feel that there's a kind of a hyper-partisanship in each country?
Yeah.
The days where we could both talk about the bipartisanship and the relationship as a core, as really a central pillar of Israel's security, That's something that Democrats and Republicans couldn't agree always on what day of the week it was or whether it was light or dark outside, but they could agree on this. And now you feel that that bipartisanship is fraying amid partisanship in both countries. And how likely is the idea of bipartisanship, or is this kind of a bygone America, and that maybe puts more of a need for aligning policies because the partisanship in both countries, instead of bringing these countries together, are going to tear them apart?
Look, I think you said earlier, sort of, you have the senior partner and the junior partner. You have a superpower and a small country that is remarkable in terms of its resiliency and strength, but it's still a small country. And the reality is it puts more of a premium on the small country to navigate and maneuver here. That small country has a huge stake in preserving Israel, not as a Republican interest, not as a Democratic interest, but as an American interest. Whatever the politics are, whatever the polarization is here, Israel can't look like it's trying to play to one side. And that's just being prudent. You know, you can have one party with you, and it doesn't mean that party won't switch. You know, for most of Israel's existence, it was the Democrats who were supportive of Israel and not the Republicans. Now the pendulum has swung. It doesn't mean it can't swing again. Look at the Republican Party right now. While the Republican Party is still strongly in favor of Israel, supportive of Israel, an increasingly important part of the Republican Party is adopting an American first attitude. How long before that translates into, well, why should we be spending all this money for Israel? When everything is seen through an American first lens, and when alliances aren't valued, you know, how long does it take for there to be a change? Maybe it's not immediate, but the pendulum can swing. Israel needs to be in a position where it is not playing favorites between the two sides. What works for 1 year, maybe in 4 years, maybe the pendulum will swing and look very different. So Israel needs to play it straight and be smart about that. And I can't say it always has been. Sometimes it's found it hard to resist the impulse to sort of play the politics. It's a mistake because it will come back to haunt them.
You know, you look at the polling data of young people in both countries, and you could say, look, the nature of young people is they tend, many, not all, of course, see things more black and white. So whatever their kind of worldview is might be exacerbated in either direction, maybe more center, liberal, left. There's differences, obviously, between central and liberal and left, of course. And in Israel, more right-leaning, more religious in uncertain ways. It just gets, for me, and as on most issues, we see things similarly, is the importance of shared values and not just shared interests. Shared interests, as I like to say, bind governments, but shared values bind societies. That is an asset that has been at the core of the U.S. Israel relationship. You know, the United States wakes up in the morning thinking, do we have shared values with the people of Belgium or other countries? Israel has captured America's imagination over time, but that's not just the promise, that's peril too, if you're out of favor. And I think in Israel, there's sometimes a phrase that you hear, hakol interesim, everything is about interest. But no, it isn't. And certainly as for Americans, it's about shared values because our priorities, we have this abiding commitment to Israel because of shared values. You think of great presidents, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, whether it's Truman, whether it's Johnson, whether it's Reagan, whether it's George W. Bush, whether it's Clinton, whether it's Biden, whoever it is, what grabs them is the shared values. The shared interest, of course, that has to be there, but it's the shared values that has really grabbed these presidents and has created these kind of visceral links. I just feel like you can never take that for value. And if you're looking at how do you future-proof the relationship going forward with all these pulls that are in centrifugal directions, what you need to think about is how do you maintain the shared values over time? Your thoughts?
Look, fundamentally, the one reality that you'll see everybody always fall back on in this country who support Israel, they'll say, it's the only democracy in the Middle East. How can we not be supportive of the only democracy in the Middle East? The reality of what prior to October 7th, when you had this extraordinary grassroots movement in Israel against what some call the judicial reform and others call the judicial overhaul, this was an effort on the part of the Israeli public at a grassroots level to protect separation of powers. to protect the independence of the judiciary. You could not have had a greater manifestation of the Israeli public's commitment to democracy than that. Here again, even for people who were critics of Israel, they had to pay attention to that. There are increasing critics of Israel. It's clear that you look at the younger demographic in this country is much more questioning of Israel. And it doesn't help when Israel has a government and has people in it who are messianic nationalists like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich who don't seem to embody those values. That raises basic questions about that. And by the way, it's not only on the left. If you look at what's happening with the evangelicals, the younger evangelicals have attitudes towards Israel that are similar to attitudes that some of the progressives have. So it's anything that would raise fundamental questions about the nature of Israel's values, anything that would begin to raise questions about the durability of its democracy will resonate back here. It will erode what is one of the pillars of the relationship. What drew us to Israel were values to begin with. Interest came later. It wasn't interest to begin with. If you go back and you look at the founding of Israel, the declaration of the state, all those who defined interests, the entire national security bureaucracy was against recognizing Israel because they saw it through the lens exclusively of interest. You had a president of the United States who saw it through the lens of values.
The last topic I really just want to talk about is something that you and I love talking about, which is the impact of the region, of the Middle East itself, of the U.S. in the Middle East, and how that impacts the U.S.-Israel relationship. And there's different dimensions here. People talk about, look, the U.S. is going to ultimately retrench from the Middle East because we're becoming more self-sufficient when it comes to being an energy exporter. We don't need the Middle East in the same way. Of course, the counter argument is, when you're a superpower, you have such varied interests, you don't want anyone tipping into recession. It impacts your market. And the U.S. is never going to be able to walk away from the Middle East. People in the administration feels like they're tearing their hair out and talking to Arab leaders saying, we are not leaving the Middle East. We're just not. Look at the troop levels. It's the same since the Carter administration. The question is, does retrenchment, if it does happen, does it make the U.S.-Israel relationship less important because the U.S. isn't engaged in the same way? Or do you say, no, it's more important because the U.S. becomes more dependent on Israeli intelligence collection or power projection, or we need to weave together pro-American regimes, governments like with the Abraham Accords and the like, these relationships of weaving these kind of institutions together, CENTCOM, the Central Command of the Military, and we'll get to that in a second, about April 13th, 14th, this amazing thing which we would have thought was a messianic age moment of all these countries, the U.S., France, Britain, Jordan, Saudi Arabia having some role, coming to intervene for Israel. Is this a luxury or a necessity? And it's something you and I have been exploring in our recent trip over there to the region. But is the U.S. being less engaged in the region? Do you see it as making the U.S.-Israel relationship less or more important?
I think it depends on why the U.S. is less engaged and how it relates to its worldview and its world posture. If the U.S. is going to adopt a retrenched approach, but believes it still has interests and therefore it needs to work with local parties, maybe the size of the American presence shrinks. Maybe it becomes more of a reduced land presence, but it's a presence that basically can be projected quickly. That's one thing, because then you become more dependent on regional actors and supporting them. But if it's driven by a sense that we don't believe in globalization, we don't see how the world is connected, everything is a transaction, not a value, we don't really need alliances, well, then the U.S.-Israeli alliance will suffer. The idea that somehow the only alliance we're going to retain is going to be the Israeli one, once you create a conceptual justification not to be playing a role internationally, then it will only be a matter of time before Israel is also part of that. So I think if we're seeing a fundamental change in terms of America's attitude towards its role in the world, that will play itself out over time in a way that will not be in Israel's interest and not in the interest of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I don't believe that's what we're going to see. Even if we see the outcome of the election in November producing a Trump-Vance administration, I'm not sure that will be sustainable over time. If that's what the purpose of the administration is, it will have its effect. But eventually there'll be a backlash to that. Because there's also an American self-image. There is an American ethos. We have a self-image of our exceptionalism. By the way, exceptionalism isn't based on transactions. It's based on self-perception of values. So over time, that will express itself. The pendulum swings in this country. We've seen the idea of America First. It's not only that the term emerged in the 1930s. The reality, there has always been a kind of, maybe under a different name, there's always been a kind of instinct towards unilateralism. It's not isolationism. It's unilateralism. Throughout the 19th century, the U.S. intervened all around the world, but we didn't have alliances. Everything was done unilaterally. The American First posture is a reflection of something that is part of the American tradition, but is not the only part of the American tradition. And the self-image of who we are, ultimately, in my mind, will override it. So I'm not saying that I look forward to seeing an American first foreign policy, at least for a period of time. What I am saying is I don't think it's enduring. I think the pendulum will switch again. And I think here again, this is why you want Israel to be steady. You want it to be steady in terms of what it represents. You want it to be steady in terms of the values it embodies. You want it to reflect what Zionism was all about.
Bill Clinton had that famous line saying, "Together if we can, alone if we must." America is the envy of the world in terms of its alliances, NATO being first and foremost. Yes, now Russia, China, and Iran seem to be converging, but how tactical is that? How transactional is that? How enduring will that be? And if you had a choice, which alliance would you rather be a part of? I think it's clear. Both of us look at whatever Iran does, whatever their proxies are. That's not alliances. That's just an axis of misery and the like. This issue of being part of a wider alliance, and like I was mentioning CENTCOM before, General Kurilla, the head of CENTCOM, I think this was a crowning achievement for him. What happened on April 13th, 14th. It was almost like a symphony where everyone played their role. And those people who care deeply about the U.S. Israel relationship should also be so proud of the Arrow and the Arrow 3, the ability to hit a bullet with a bullet. This is something that the two countries have worked on together. And between CENTCOM and Israel alone, over 300 projectiles of Iran were thwarted. This was not just a pro forma thing of Iran. This was a very big deal. And here we really saw alliances come through. And it gets to the question, is this a necessity or is this a luxury? I'm clear Israel would love to work together in a big group if possible, but it doesn't know for sure it'll always have that kind of alignment. It could influence that if there's a breakthrough with Saudi Arabia and you cement a more anti-Iranian alliance of sorts. But Defense Minister Gallant said to us, he said 7 fronts Israel's facing. Israel's responded to 6 of the 7, didn't respond, I think, to the Houthis, but so many fronts. And yet the ethos of the U.S. Israel relationship is we in America want to help Israel defend itself by itself. But when you have 7 fronts, you wonder, how is that a dated idea? Is it still possible for Israel to defend itself by itself? Is it going to become more dependent on the United States or not? You could say some of these things are not a question of policy, but it's also a question of the defense industries. And can Israel develop more of an independent capability? The United States, we're trying to sustain war in Ukraine. We're trying to sustain the war in Gaza. It's not easy to have surge production and the like. So I'm just trying to see how this new Middle East is emerging, because it does seem like a bit of a race between those who want to normalize with Israel versus those who want to criminalize Israel. And these two different forces are racing in opposite directions. And the United States is trying to support Israel, and yet there are so many fronts of the Iranian proxies that it is testing old approaches. And we'll wonder if some of these approaches, like defend itself by itself, do some of these older views have to be reassessed in light of current realities?
I think the short answer is yes. The issue of defend yourself by yourself grew out of a necessity. Israel didn't have a choice. It's not like it had an alternative. So it had to defend itself by itself, and it needed the perception that it would as a way of reinforcing its deterrent. Now today, you think about the value of not just this collection or coalition that exists. That's another way to enhance deterrence, because it demonstrates that we collectively can blunt what you do. We can raise the cost to you of what you do. You will fail, which is essentially deterrence through denial. Deterrence through punishment is we impose a cost. Deterrence through denial is you won't achieve your military objective. This coalition can create deterrence through denial. For deterrence through punishment, something else is required. By the way, I believe it is required. I think that Iran has to know it has something to lose. If all you do is blunt what they do, okay, it didn't work, but we can try it again. If what you can do is blunt what they do on the one hand and impose a cost on them at the same time, we've seen the Iranians are very leery of absorbing their own costs. They'll fight to the last of their proxies other than Hezbollah, but they're not keen at all on absorbing their own price. I think the reality from Israel's standpoint is it a luxury? No, it's not a luxury. Is it a necessity? I would say it's something other than a necessity. The necessity means Israel has no choice. Look, the truth is, take the night of April 13th, April 14th. If Israel had had to do this all by itself, it could have. The cost to Israel would have been higher. There would have been more than 4 penetrations of ballistic missiles because Israel would have been spread more thinly, and it would have had to do everything even more perfectly than it did. By reducing the number it had to go after, it was able to concentrate its assets more effectively. If it was spread more thinly, it would not have been as successful. Is that a necessity? Not quite. I would say you had help, but by having help, it means the cost becomes more manageable. The real issue is cost. Can Israel still do these things by itself? Yes, but you were raising the issue of what they would have to do if it's on their own. What percent of their GDP would have to be going for defense? You'll change the character of Israel in the process. If Israel is spending 12 or 13% of its GDP on defense, which, given the size of how large its standing army is going to have to be, given the fact it might have to do this all by itself, that becomes quite realistic. And what is Iran's strategy towards Israel? Was it to acquire a nuclear weapon to drop it on Israel? No, because it understands what the consequence for Iran will be. Its strategy was to create this ring of fire and make Israel unlivable. So the more you can show, it's not going to happen because there's a coalition here, and Israel's part of that coalition. This is profoundly in Israel's interest. I think this notion of luxury versus necessity, it's too much of a bifurcation. It's not totally black and white. It's some combination of both. It is something that you're trying to make this more cost manageable. And it's in Israel's interest to do that, but it's also in Israel's interest for another reason, because this is the key to changing the region as a whole. I always call the axis of resistance the axis of misery, because it is. Anybody who's part of that axis, their people are miserable, and they have no hope and no possibility. What you want is to increasingly show there's a coalition that's going to counter and confront this axis of misery. That, over time, will end up defeating that axis. You really want Israel to adopt what I would call a winning strategy, not a strategy where it's left on its own, not a strategy where it isolates itself, not a strategy where it has to do everything by itself. And ultimately, that will also affect Israel's values domestically. We've made this conversation, we've hinged it to the idea of interests and values, because the U.S. Israeli relationship was built on a pillar of values. Being part of this coalition, ironically, makes it easier for Israel to sustain its values, because Israel will have to make some choices. To talk about a Palestinian state today, it's unrealistic. Think about it from the standpoint, what is the Palestinian identity today? Is it Hamas, even if it's weakened, or is it the PA and Fatah? Is it an identity of Islamism, rejection, and armed resistance? Or is it going to be an ideology that's nationalist, secular, and basically geared towards coexistence? We collectively have an interest in having it move in a certain direction. So does Israel. So Israel's own behavior can't be such that it makes it less likely it can move in that direction. If we can move in that direction, and it might be a function of the Saudi deal, if it can be done by this administration before the end, then you're making this coalition much more likely, and you're shaping the region, not just Israel, you're shaping the region and Israel's place in the region in a way that serves Israel's long-term well-being as a Jewish democratic state.
If you go back to Ben Gurion, and Shimon Peres, before he died, wrote this final book, We Dream Too Small. If you would have told Ben Gurion, look, it might take time, but there's going to be a moment where the Saudis and Israel are on the same place. Jordan is going to help intercede and give its airspace to Israel to help block rejectionists pointed at Israel. In some ways, the future could not be brighter if it's handled correctly. And sometimes we're so deep into the details of this Gaza war, we don't always step back and look at the big picture that, as you said correctly about the circle of fire of the Iranians, the ring of fire, whether it's Iran, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Hezbollah. We could debate what is a proxy and what isn't a proxy, but what's common to them are these are three different actors who are dedicated to ensure that there is no Israel under any border. They are the forces of rejection. And if Israel can emerge from this war looking at the bigger regional picture and say, here are the people that see us as more Israel is good for them, whether it's because of regional stability, whether it's before technology, whatever the reason, there's a good part of the Middle East that believes that it's in their interest that Israel be stronger. I don't think it's a coincidence that these are the forces, these forces of rejection, these forces that want no coexistence with Israel. They're the ones who, in different levels, are using rockets against Israel. But instead of seeing the region as a monolith and kind of hunkering down, look at the possibilities. Any statesman has to look not just at discerning dangers, but seizing opportunities. And what is the right equilibrium between these things? There's some real prospects. And April's 12th, 13th, for me, is a sense that this region can be brighter if handled very carefully, deftly by leaders. We shall stay tuned, but I just want to thank you, Dennis. Fantastic way to kick off the new season. I always like sports metaphors, and who better than you knows that. I want to thank you for this kickoff and helping us try to hopefully hit a home run on our first episode of the new season, and urge everyone to stay tuned. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Through the ups and downs, the key pillars that have sustained the U.S. Israel relationship have been the perception that Israel shares America's interests, but more importantly, its core values. A strong and stable U.S. Israel relationship requires also trust between leaders and governments, careful and private management of crises, and conscious commitment on both sides. Sustaining the alliance will require tough decisions about big issues, sure to face both Israel and the United States, long after the fighting in Gaza is over. We'll continue to explore these and other related issues throughout the season. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Sidney Helbush and Gabriel Epstein, as well as intern David Ederberg. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like you for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can grow this community. You can find Decision Points on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Download and subscribe to never miss an episode. To our listeners from all over the world, I hope you listen to all of Season 5 of Decision Points.